Hola, soy Berta Rojas. Les doy la bienvenida al ciclo de conferencias Sonoridades Paraguayas presentadas por Deporeka 2022. Hoy me toca el privilegio de presentarles a tres queridos amigos. La profesora y doctora Simone Krueger-Bridge, quien es presidenta del Comité de Investigaciones de Posgrado de la Facultad de Artes, Estudios Profesionales y Sociales de la Universidad John Moores en Liverpool, en el Reino Unido. Su área de investigación envuelve la sociología cultural, la etnomusicología y estudios sobre la música popular. Simone ha disertado extensivamente sobre Deporeka, por lo cual estamos muy agradecidas con ella. Por otra parte, el profesor doctor Alfredo Colman, querido amigo, paraguayo, profesor de musicología y etnomusicología en la Universidad de Baylor. Y antes de llegar allí, fue profesor de música en la Universidad Evangélica del Paraguay, ya en los Estados Unidos, en Southwestern University y en la Universidad de Texas. Por otra parte, lo querido Timo, como le llamamos sus amigos, el profesor y doctor Timoteo Watkins, quien creció en Ciudad del Este, donde pasó su niñez y su juventud. Se traslada a los Estados Unidos, continúa sus estudios universitarios y posgrado allí. Él es profesor de musicología en la Texas Christian University y su labor se concentra principalmente en investigar la música del Paraguay y de América Latina. Y su enfoque principalmente está en las consecuencias musicales del encuentro entre las culturas europeas e indígenas. Los tres investigadores nos presentan la conferencia que llamaron una aproximación a la música paraguaya, métodos, técnicas y perspectivas. En esta conferencia ellos van a relatarnos sus experiencias investigando temas que se relacionan a la música paraguaya, así como también sus publicaciones y sus ponencias que han presentado en congresos de musicología, las que les han permitido a ellos una amplia y rica perspectiva en relación a lo complejo que es la exploración académica en este tema. Al compartir sus enfoques en metodologías de la investigación, la aplicación interdisciplinaria de teorías sociales y la interpretación de hechos y resultados, ellos buscan dejar una contribución para la próxima generación de investigadores y al mismo tiempo motivar al público en general a no solamente apreciar los sonidos de la música paraguaya, sino también a pensar en las distintas maneras en que ésta interactúa, se conecta con las complejidades de la cultura paraguaya. Quiero agradecer muy especialmente a Simón, Alfredo y Timoteo por sus enormes contribuciones con las que honran al proyecto Deporeka. Esta va a ser una preciosa oportunidad de conocer más del trabajo de ellos, así que les invito a disfrutarlo. Muchas gracias. Nos vemos.
Hello, welcome to this roundtable on research on Paraguayan music. I am Tim Watkins, and also joining me today are Dr. Alfredo Colman and Simone Krueger-Bridge. We hope you find our conversation today of interest and helpful in some way. We thought that the first thing we would do is introduce ourselves and talk about our background with Paraguayan music, because frequently that informs the way in which we approach our topic. I was fortunate to have grown up in Paraguay, though my parents are U.S. citizens. They are from the United States. I spent my entire childhood and adolescence in Paraguay, primarily in the city of Ciudad del Este. All my friends, of course, were Paraguayan. I attended school at the Centro Regional de Educación, and I was in the choir there. So that was one of the ways in which I began to understand and be exposed to Paraguayan music from the inside, as it were. Not only singing in the choir at the Centro Regional, but also making music with my friends. At the time, there was no Paraguayan television in the area back in the early 1970s. So we spent a lot of time using music as recreation. We would go to each other's homes and we would sing, we would play guitar. I learned to play guitar from my Paraguayan friends, and we would sing not only Paraguayan folk music, guaranias and polkas and other songs as well. But we would also sing the music of other areas of Latin America, sambas, for example, from Argentina, Andean music, even Mexican music sometimes, rancheras and boleros. So I grew up spending a lot of time thinking about what Paraguayan music is and how it relates to the music of other parts of Latin America, how it's similar, how it's different, especially since, as you may know, there was a law at the time that a certain percentage of music played on the radio had to be Paraguayan folk music. And since we all spent a lot of time listening to the radio, listening to music on the radio, I began to think about these questions of what is it that makes Paraguayan music Paraguayan. I came to the United States to do my college work and then my postgraduate work. I began by studying church music and conducting. Later, I switched to musicology, and I wrote my master's thesis on Domenico Zipoli in the Jesuit province of Paraguay, based on some of the music from the recently discovered manuscripts in the Concepcion archive in Bolivia. I also wanted to do my doctoral dissertation on Paraguayan music, but for whatever reason could not decide on a particular methodology or even a focus with which to approach Paraguayan music at the time. So I wrote my dissertation on polyphonic music in early colonial Mexico. But that did lead me in general to the field of the musical consequences of the interaction of European and indigenous cultures in Latin America. And of course, that's very much tied to Paraguayan music. And since then, of course, I have written quite a bit about Paraguayan music and am continuing to research and write on Paraguayan music. And that's my background. We will probably come back to some of that, but I would like to hand the baton to my colleague, Alfredo Colman. Please weigh in with your background, Alfredo.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you to Doctora for this opportunity to make possible this conversatorio, this roundtable. Yeah, so in regard to my background, very similar to Tim, actually. I was born in Asunción. I grew up with the sounds of the city coming from the radio, coming from the TV as well, in regard to folk music, especially. So in a way, I was highly influenced by those sounds, also sounds coming from the church, singing in the choir, also playing the piano at an early age, studying piano from the conservatory program as well. And part of that training was folklore or folk music from Paraguay. And I welcomed those sounds. Also, during that time, radio stations and TV stations as well were supposed to be playing a certain percentage of Paraguayan or folk music by a government mandate. And in a way, that was, although forced into the people, a way to disseminate folk music. And I was familiar with those sounds. And I always had a deep appreciation for them. I remember especially a TV show from Channel 9, Canal 9, on Sunday, around noon or so, time for lunch. And as you all know, lunch time on Sundays in Paraguay is huge, or at least it was huge when I was growing up. And this particular TV show, Domingos Folclóricos, would feature soloists, also folk dances and conjuntos performing the staples of Paraguayan music. And that exercised a big influence in my musical formation, I would say, and training. At the same time, my grandfather, when he turned, I would say, 70 or so, decided to take harp lessons. He played the guitar. He fought in the Chaco War, but he admired the harp and had never taken a lesson. But he learned harp from a neighbor who lived across the street from his house. And I remember going on Saturday afternoons to visit my grandparents and spend time with them there and listening to my grandfather practicing practicing the harp and also the guitar. I always had an admiration for that. When I was also taking piano lessons, I asked my parents for Paraguayan harp, and in parallel, I started taking lessons. I studied with Heriberto Leguizamón for a couple of years, and I didn't become a professional harpist, but my appreciation for the instrument grew quite a lot. So after high school, I went to the university in Asunción. I decided to major in psychology. And after a couple of years, actually, I was able to come to the US for college. And so I majored in similar way as Tim in church music, but my concentration was in piano. After that, I continued with more graduate studies. And at that point, I wanted also to write a thesis or a document on colonial music in Paraguay. And so I did my best. It didn't happen. So in the end, I wrote a document on the cithern, that is a Renaissance instrument connected to an English composer, Thomas Robinson, who in 1609 had published the first tutor or book of instructions for the cithern in England, which I thought was quite fascinating. Then later, I decided to go on for a doctorate in ethnomusicology, and that's when I went into in depth in regard to Latin American music, which was my concentration, and especially the Paraguayan harp, which became the topic of my doctoral dissertation. Also, I was highly influenced by the professors, especially my mentor there, and a deep appreciation for Latin American music that the university had at that time. So since then, I've been wondering about issues such as cultural identity in Paraguay, musical identity, musical cultures, musical nationalism, questions that also open doors for and opportunities for conferences, publications of articles, monographs as well. And I'm not done. I continue to study and do research and learn. So I'm very thankful again for this opportunity. So in a nutshell, that has been my training, influence, background in regard to music and Paraguayan music more specifically. So now I would like to pass the microphone to Dr. Krueger-Bridge, to Simone, who will also share with us her experience in music.
Thank you also to Japorica 2022 for this kind invitation to share our experiences and background and why or how we have come to study and research and publish about Paraguayan music. And it's wonderful to share the platform with my colleagues, Alfredo and Tim, on this very special occasion. So thank you, everybody. So I am a cultural outsider, not from Paraguay. I grew up in Germany and I live in England. So I live in Liverpool for 25 years approximately. But I did develop an interest in Paraguayan music in 2010 particularly when I heard about a publication by Robert Munro, who compiled a very beautiful book called Paraguay 200, which you can see in the slide, which was launched at a special event in the Instituto Cervantes in London. And I attended the book launch, where I met Robert Munro, as well as his family, and some of the contributors, as well as the then ambassador of Paraguay to the UK. So Robert Munro was very kind as well to introduce me to Maestro Luis Serran at the time. And you can see in the slide shown on screen now that Luis Serran then visited Liverpool in April 2011 and presented a talk to students at Liverpool universities, which cemented my interest in Paraguayan music. I was a classical guitarist. So, and with that background, I immediately felt a strong affinity, particularly with Paraguayan guitar music. However, I found that musical activity in Paraguay is, until fairly recently, quite unknown to the wider world, with some exceptions. And this knowledge was particularly shaped during my studies and specialisms in ethnomusicology. So I completed a PhD after I completed musicological and performance-related training. I completed a PhD at the University of Sheffield in the UK in ethnomusicology, where I became familiar with the literature on musics from around the world, and Paraguay was critically absent from that literature. At the same time, I found that most people, wherever I encountered literature, pay attention to the classical guitar of Agustín Barrios, rightly so. However, at the same time, there's very little known about the origins of the guitar in Paraguay, other than that it was acculturated from Spanish imports. So, and this interest and knowledge resulted in a visit to Paraguay for several months, from late June until September 2011, which was also at the 200th anniversary of independence from Spain, during which I found that the guitar occupies a very prominent role in all spheres of life, and it does indeed transcend musical genres and styles. So, for example, while I met Maestra Beata Rojas, another classical guitarist, I also met rock guitarist Rolando Chaparro, who at the time arranged and recorded the album Bohemio. And you can see the cover also on the slide displayed here. In that album that he recorded and arranged in tribute to Barrios's life and work. And that research with Rolando and his work resulted in presentations and publications on the revival and adaptation of the compositions of the great Paraguayan classical guitarist composer Agustín Barrios Mangore in contemporary Paraguayan music, such as that of Rolando Chaparro. And some examples can be seen on the slides, where you can see presentations I've delivered, for example, at the Goethe University in Frankfurt in Germany, as well as other universities, just to give you some examples. So that is me, and I think that we would like now to continue to talk about some examples of our research and show you a little bit more what each of us are doing and how that contributes to a body of growing literature on Paraguayan music. So first, I would like to invite Alfredo back to the stage to tell us a little bit more about his research and give us some examples of it.
Thank you, Simone. Yeah, so in this section, we want to talk about the topics that we've been investigating, writing about our methodology, right, which is a big word, but just simply means, how we approach, an idea, a topic, and how we develop that into an idea that needs to be explored, discussed, and then shared with people. And also what sort of influences we receive from other disciplines, and also from ideas or theories that people have proposed, and finally how we interpret facts. And in reality, just to provide a very brief context, if I may, musicology and ethnomusicology, other disciplines such as anthropology as well, they interact with each other, meaning that we use tools coming from those disciplines, and those disciplines use tools coming from musicology or ethnomusicology. So in reality, it's a conversation of multiple voices, which makes the research experience quite amazing and rich. And we look at places such as, again, anthropology, but also history, journalism, sociology, music theory, composition, organology, the discipline that studies instruments. So from multiple angles, right, to provide a coherent but argument and an explanation of that. All right, so in my case, how do I deal with methodology? Well, in general, what I do first is I think about an idea or a topic. When I was doing my doctoral work, I chose the Paraguayan harp because the affinity that I had with the instrument. I also knew that not a lot had been written about the harp in academia, in Spanish or in English. So I wanted to provide a document that would help others, to understand this instrument that is so representative of Paraguay. And at the same time, it wasn't just about the harp, but what is the representation of the harp? So that was my next step. And I thought, well, the Paraguayan harp seems to represent this idea of Paraguayidad, or Paraguayan cultural identity. And so I thought, well, maybe I'm right, or maybe I'm not right, but I'm gonna investigate and go through the steps to understand what is going on. So what methodology I used for that particular topic? Well, I had a journalistic approach, meaning asking questions: who, when, why, how, for how long, questions that journalists or good journalists ask to understand a particular idea or event or musical figure, for instance. Also, I had interviews. So I went into oral history, collecting conversations and dialogues that I had with performers of the harp, but also with sociologists, anthropologists, journalists, teachers, and also people who would attend music festivals, just to understand what was the perception of the harp in Paraguayan music. Because of that, I had to collect examples of live performances, but also I managed to create a library of CDs during that time. Now we're more digital, but also records, tape cassettes, anything that I would be able to find. If there was published music or published methods for the harp, which I found quite a few, in collecting items, again, such as maybe manuscripts of arrangements or things that I was able to transcribe by ear and study. The next point, or the next step, was to analyze, listen to that music, listen to the harmony, listen to the melody and the rhythm, and see what elements were typical or characteristic in regard to Paraguayan music. After that, adding some archival work, going to libraries. I went to Villarrica library of a school there. I went to the Biblioteca Nacional as well, libraries of other musical institutions, the Biblioteca Municipal, for instance, in Asunción. And so I just getting a hold of items. The Museo Andrés Barbero as well was very significant because of their publications in anthropology, for instance. And after that, reading books and articles by Paraguayan authors first, books about music, but also books on Paraguayan history and folklore, a variety of also books by Latin American specialists, by European scholars, by scholars in the US as well. And after that, developing a framework or a way to interpret or understand. That was the next big step. After that collection of items, which took about, in my case, 18 months. So this was not a very, fast project. Then I had to sit down and read some more. And in regard to the application of other disciplines or theories, just understanding ideas coming from people such as Bartomeu Meliá, who was one of the first ones, if not the first academic specialist in the 20th century who was wrestling with this idea of the Guarani, Paraguayan identity, and the idea of the imagined Paraguayan culture, ideas that come also from the pen of sociologists and anthropologists. And so Meliá was of a big influence in my own research. Also, an author from England, Benedict Anderson, who talks about the idea of communities and being this group of people that in reality are imagined communities. We in Paraguay or anywhere in the world, in the US or in England, we don't know everyone. We don't know each other, but we're part of a group or a community that is imagined. And so that was highly influential in the interpretation of facts as well. And the composer from Paraguay, Florentin Jimenez, who had a deep regard for the Guarania as the essence of being Paraguayan, and in his writings, he proposes the idea over and over. So I was looking at those types of positions, ideas, and then coming into my own work to interpret those facts. And finally, I would do the following, right? Taking those big ideas, again, cultural identity, musical nationalism, and other ones, and seeing, all right, could I prove my hypotheses? Or, for instance, that the Paraguayan harp is an instrument that illustrates Paraguayan culture or identity. Is it a true symbol of that? Well, then I had to interact with different disciplines and theories to engage in conversation with my ideas and what other authors who were not talking about the harp, but about other issues, and how I could draw some connections there. Also engaging in conversation in a way with Meliá, with Jimenez, with Anderson, and other authors. Also finding if the examples, the music that I collected, would prove or disprove my hypotheses. And finally, proposing a conclusion, right? In a way, affirming my hypotheses or indicating that in reality, there was another way to interpret, for instance, what the Paraguayan harp represented. I was very glad that in the end, at least for that topic, my hypotheses turned to be correct. And so I was very excited about that. Currently, I'm working on another topic, the works and the musical nationalism of Florentin Jimenez, and I'm in the process of exactly going through all those multiple steps. So far, it's been 10 years of that research project, and every day I'm learning something new. So it's quite an exciting time to do research. So I want to pass the microphone now to Tim, who would also like to share with us about his methodology.
Thank you very much. This question of methodologies is quite interesting, but also puzzling, I think, sometimes to people who are not engaging in the sorts of research that we engage in. And it's important, I think, to point out that the methodologies that one chooses will naturally vary according to the questions that one is asking. So, for example, people think of historians and historical musicologists as having one set of approaches, and ethnomusicologists and anthropologists having another set of methodologies. But as is frequently the case for those of us who study Latin American music, we wind up using methodologies from all over the academic spectrum, depending on the particular questions we're asking at any one time. And those questions can change as our research progresses. So, for example, researching a specifically musical, historical topic, such as the use of music in the Jesuit missions, the reducciones in Paraguay, will call for historical methodologies, will call for a careful reading of original sources, such as the Jesuit Cartas Annuas that all of the provinces forwarded to Rome every year, reporting on their activities in their area. That requires a very careful reading because, of course, they want to themselves look as good as possible. So you have to dig through the details there and think, what is really going on? Reading books from, for example, 18th century Jesuits after their expulsion from Latin America, thinking about what it is they're describing and how it affects music. In the case of for example, music in Trinidad, with the famous frieze of angel musicians around the chancel of the church. There are methodologies from organology, the study of instruments, also from iconography, the study of art, and specifically musical iconography, how musical instruments are portrayed and how the playing of musical instruments is portrayed. All of those methodologies from different fields then come to bear on the particular questions being asked. And I had to do that certainly in my study of music in the Jesuit reductions, not only in my master's thesis, but in a book chapter that I published a few years ago on instrumental music and instruments in the Jesuit reductions. On another topic, of course, as Alfredo has said, where there are scores available, where there are musical scores, those have to be carefully analyzed from a theoretical perspective. How is the music similar to? How is it different from music that was being composed in Europe, for example, at the time? How might those differences be accounted for in terms of different performance forces, voice qualities, kinds of instruments that might have been used in Paraguay? The role of music in contemporary Paraguay calls for a quite different set of approaches. For example, a conference paper I gave recently on the role of music in Paraguayan asados, right, required methodologies from anthropology, for example, participant observation. In that case, it meant that I had to actually go to an asado and eat good Paraguayan asado, enjoy the company of friends, and also listen to and participate in the music making there. But that's a much more anthropological and ethnographic sort of approach. I also had to engage in interviews with the participants in asados and ask about the types of music that are normally played and performed, and the role of learning in musical learning in their background, things like that. Researching the relationship of music to Paraguayan identity, cultural identity, and national identity. This is one of the things that Alfredo and I have in common. We focus a lot on this question. As he mentioned, that requires being familiar with literature from political science, for example. In my work, the work of Ernest Gellner, an important theorist of nationalism, is important. He mentioned also as well Benedict Anderson, of course, also quite important. One has to be familiar with that literature and bring the insights of those authors to bear on questions relating not only to Paraguay, but then specifically to music and Paraguay. Paraguayan cultural critics as well, Melia, I think Alfredo mentioned as well, very important. And also historians, both Paraguayan and European from the United States, historians of Paraguayan social and political history as well. All of that has to be brought to bear on this particular question of cultural identity and national identity and how music plays into that. Encyclopedia articles. I've written a number of encyclopedia articles on Paraguayan music, indigenous music as well in Paraguay. That requires a very different approach. It requires a broad familiarity not only with the general topic, but also with important studies by other musicians and other scholars, many times anthropologists, ethnographers, who may have included just little bits of details about music and musical instruments in their larger works about the cultures that they have studied. I think for all of us, I'm safe to say that we begin with smaller questions and smaller projects that result in conference papers, that result in smaller articles, that result in book chapters. And then as we continue to research, the ideas that we develop in those smaller publications and presentations then begin to get linked together in our minds, but not only in our minds, but also in larger publications, such as books, such as the one I'm working on now on the topic of Paraguayan cultural identity as it's expressed through music. I could say much more, of course, but it's probably time to pass the baton, the microphone to my colleague, Simone Krueger-Bridge.
I would say that my approach to studying Paraguayan music is shaped most and foremost by the disciplines of anthropology and ethnomusicology. But I must say that I mean Anglo-American versions of these disciplines. I am aware from having published a special issue, for example, that, for example, ethnomusicology, its scope, the methods, the approaches, and the theories in different countries differs. So it is important to understand that Anglo-American, by which I mean North American, US-based, and British ethnomusicology is shaped has shaped sort of the way I approach Paraguayan music, and it may not be the same in other, say, Latin American countries or indeed across Eastern Europe, for example. So, and specifically I have been shaped by the scholarly contributions made by John Blacking, who was, of course, a very well-known, very famous anthropologist. And he published a monumental work called How Musical is Man, which touched me deeply. It touched me on a deep humanitarian level, and also on a level of how do you understand music in different cultural contexts. So as I said, I am a cultural outsider. How can you bring sensitivity and a proper understanding into, say, Paraguayan music when I'm not from there? At the same time, I was also very shaped by Alan Merriam's Anthropology of Music, also published, a few decades ago, which particularly helped me understand that one can study music as music. So we can study music theory and the notes and the harmony and the rhythm and the texture and these sorts of things. And at the same time, we must place this music in its socio-cultural context in order to understand it fully. So Alan Merriam coined the term understanding music as culture, or us, or in culture. So to understand the cultural nuances of, say, a different country, to me, such as Paraguay, is important in order to understand the music more deeply. So, and these influences have shaped my study of music in its cultural or socio-cultural context, most and foremost, which is achieved through ethnography. So I've lectured for many, many years about ethnography as a method of research and writing, and I've published the student guide in English, which can be seen on screen. Subsequently, I have been influenced by, again, British-based popular music studies, which has helped me to also to gain a broad understanding about musics and to discard the canons of good music versus bad music that go hand in hand with good taste versus bad taste. And I've also been shaped by music sociology, as well as what I then became known to as cultural musicology. And all of these are very helpful combined when studying music as music and music as culture in Paraguay, for example. So as I say, ethnographic research helps me to collect so-called raw data through interviewing, through observing, through being there virtually. I've been participating in virtual activities around Paraguayan music, for example, and being in touch with colleagues such as Tim and Alfredo. I conduct wide literature searches with everything I do. It's very important to establish oneself as a scholar of a topic while knowing the literature that exists. There are some limitations in my use of Spanish, which has obvious methodological implications. And then I go about, on the one hand, simply describing my observations and what I see and what I hear by talking to people. And I'll also conduct more theoretical analysis, which is called bottom-up analysis or grounded theory, where I try to find theoretical concepts to explain what I see and what I hear from people. And such themes include things like identity too, particularly ethnicity and class-based identities. And I've written recently an article about that in the Journal of the Royal Musical Association, which is publicly available. I am also interested in experience, meaning, and value, which has particularly led me to research Japorika 2021, which will lead also to an edited book that is co-edited together with Tim and Alfredo, which will be published by Equinox Publisher in the UK. that particularly focus on Paraguayan song and with exploring the themes of experience, meaning, and value. And those sorts of themes are particularly shaped by music sociology and cultural theory and those sorts of disciplines that I mentioned already. I must also say that my ideas around identity have been shaped largely by existing writings on the topic Paraguayan identity, including obviously Alfredo's writings, as well as Tim's writings on the topic. So essentially, these themes are broadly situated in ethnomusicology and anthropology of music, popular music studies, music sociology, and cultural musicology. And I've also published encyclopedia articles that focus on Paraguayan music in its socio-cultural and historical context. So the context is always there and very important. At the same time, I also have written a book about globalization and capitalism and identity and how that is visible in world popular music. And I include an example of Barrios in the book, because Barrios is one of the first recording classical guitarists who recorded his music as early as 1911, I believe. Sorry if I make the actual date wrong, but it was in the early 20th century when sound recording technologies were only just pioneered. The book deals with sound recording that turned music into a commodity. So Barrios is mentioned as an example in my book in regards to early sound recording technologies and the process of turning music into a commodity for sale and marketing. And in terms of interpretation, I've already mentioned bottom-up analysis. So when I've collected people's voices or observations and I write them up in descriptions, I try to search for their significance, what is important and what isn't so important. And I find that, for example, in people's explanations or when similar issues are expressed more frequently than other issues. So, for example, my research in Paraguay, I found that a lot of people I spoke to do talk about Paraguayan identity and the pride they feel about being Paraguayan. So it became a theme in the research. It grew out of talking to people, which I then explored theoretically or conceptually, drawing on existing literature. I also tried to corroborate these findings with existing literature, as well as with people. So, for example, I sent my research to those who I write about, and I also have conversations with experts who are joined here with us today about the research. And the more formal process involves what is called peer review. So particularly in the Anglican American world, all research that is published is peer reviewed, which basically is a process by which a submitted article or book is being sent out to specialists and experts internationally who give their opinion on the value of this publication and whether it is ready for publications and what the author has to do in order for it to be better. That ensures that our interpretation of facts is vigorous and valuable and accepted within the academic specialist community, particularly. In the social sciences, this process is often called triangulation. So to corroborate data or theories that we grow out or concepts and corroborate them with at least 3 other methods, including literature. Triangulation in itself is really useful as an approach for reliability and validity, but it's not really widespread in the music studies. But it does provide the useful guiding principle for analysis and how we interpret facts. So at this point, I would like to draw our conclusion together, which I believe will be kickstarted by myself. So we, the 3 of us, Alfredo, Tim, and myself, we clearly have different perspectives, different backgrounds, and different approaches to studying Paraguayan music. However, it is fair to say that we do share a bipartite focus on music as sound on the one hand, as well as music as culture, which I explained earlier before. So, and those concepts, those ideas help us to understand and shape the way in which we can understand how music interacts with the complexities of Paraguayan culture. So for me, for example, the term ethnomusicology isn't very helpful because firstly, the discipline is interpreted in different ways across the globe, and it is ripe of misunderstandings and misinterpretations. So I don't like it because it is actually a very encompassing discipline. However, it does have certain baggage. The second question would be, are we musicologists? And again, probably in Britain or in Germany, people may think we wouldn't be necessarily musicologists because we do not focus on classical music exclusively, and we do not focus on music theory and music history exclusively. So where are we? And for me, the solution is cultural musicology, because for me it encompasses an inclusive approach to the types of music I study, as well as it highlights the emphasis on culture. And it draws on music theory, music history, and it includes, of course, ideas around popular music and music sociology too. So I'd like to hand over to Tim to hear how he shares this perspective.
Yes, thank you. Some really important things there. And I think this idea of cultural musicology is important because it has to do not only with the cultural study of music, but also the musical study of culture. And I think that all three of us engage in both of those sorts of approaches. Your idea of cultural musicology, of course, and this is not unique to us, but it's something that others have spoken and written about as well. Does remind me, however, and I know you said that you didn't really like the term ethnomusicology, but I am reminded, you mentioned Alan Merriam earlier. I'm reminded of his change in definition of ethnomusicology from the study of music in culture to the study of music as culture. And I think that probably has some bearing here as well. We probably ought to also acknowledge that the sort of disciplinary division between musicology, qua-musicology, historical musicology, and ethnomusicology is really not as wide, not as definite as it once was, and we might actually even question that narrative, whether that approach ever really was as wide, whether that separation was as wide as the narrative has it. Because the approach to the study of music in its cultural context, or the study of music as culture itself, I think is common not only to us, but to a lot of, to many scholars, whether they would think of themselves as primarily ethnomusicologists or primarily historical musicologists. And that gets back to one of the topics that I was trying to highlight earlier, which is that the approach that one takes has to vary. The methodology that one takes has to vary according to the particular questions that one is asking. And of course, it is possible to study music just from a theoretical perspective. But the really interesting questions, I think, come at the intersection of music and culture, music as sound and music as culture. And I'm thrilled to be able to work at that intersection and to be able to work with colleagues such as the two of you.
I wish I could add more and say more to that, but that is what we're doing. And just as a corollary, what I would like to say is that we're looking at music, first of all, in general, as sound, but also we're looking at those who make music, the value of music, right? So we're looking at music as culture through both lenses, and regardless of our areas of interests, which are heart music, colonial music, Guarani as culture and as a language, or even the study that you did on Jeporeka, Simone. In the end, we all are trying to go to culture after that and explain the meaning behind those things. So regardless, if we look at an artifact, a musical instrument, a musical score, a musical composition, a musical figure, anything, we go there, right? And so at least from my end, and I was writing notes as you all were talking, I see that music not only reflects that aspect of culture, or a aspect of culture, but also expresses culture, and at the same time transmits that culture, right? What is a culture that is not fixed, but it's organic and it moves? And that's what makes, I think, this approach of cultural musicology exciting, because we have facts from the past that we look and evaluate the present, but also in 10 years, we may be looking at our own research topics and see how things have changed or how people have interpreted those ideas differently. And I think that's what I find exciting about what we do. So with that in mind, once again, I want to say thank you to Jeporeka 2022 for this opportunity, and thank you to Simone and team for this time. I don't know if we have a couple of minutes just to interact and ask questions to each other in general, but if so,
probably a good idea. Yeah, I think so.
Perhaps we could use maybe what's called a lightning round, and just go very, very fast. So let me throw one question to you, Simone. What is that which attracted you to the sound of the music of Agustín Barrios? The first time you heard it, what is that which sparked interest through your ears and into your mind?
I mean, yes, it's very interesting. And having a classical guitar background, I was familiar with the standard, particularly Spanish classical guitar repertoire, and played it as well, including also some Latin American composers. And what attracted me to Barrios was, in essence, his little bit about his otherness, for a better word. He is renowned to have played on a guitar that has metal strings. For example, I myself have very hard nails, and I was a very physical, player, not performer, but player. And I like that particular aspect about his playing too. So the music itself is incredibly challenging. And I felt very sorry for him because he was so neglected. So I think it was more like my charitable heart, and also sort of a bit of a such a humanitarian, humanist ideas that I sought out. Music that was neglected, that was written out of textbooks and so on and so forth. That was what attracted me to ethnomusicology. So I think it reflects a wider idea around, searching for things that are not written in textbooks, things that are new or different, So I found that fascinating, and that attracted me to it, as well as more generally the guitar. I mean, interestingly, when I was in Paraguay, I did try to discover the guitar more generally, but I was sucked into the Barrios revival at the time, which automatically happened, and it was wonderful. Obviously, it was wonderful because it is music and a composer that Paraguayans should and can be very proud of. And at the same time, it really reflected the fact that Barrios plays such a prominent role also in current identity making and shaping and thinking and so on. So there was clearly a search through music to express the self individually, but also collectively. So, and music was I found when people talked about it and introduced me to Barrios, I'm very proud of it. It was a way of saying, look, this is me, this is us, this is Paraguayan music, this is Paraguayan culture. So I found it fascinating to then look at this music, and particularly also how it was adopted and performed by others, including Rolando Chaparro. He wasn't the only one, there were many others, and I wrote about this, what I called the so-called revival at the time, with many, many examples, including Beata Rojas's tours and so on. So I found it fascinating then to use music as a mirror through which to understand society, which is, I think, another metaphor of explaining what we do in culture musicology. It's a portrait, to look at it, view it, and see cultural particularities about what Paraguayan identity means to people. So meaning, value, what is their value? And as I say, I don't pretend to know completely from the inside. I would never do that. But it is fascinating to discover an unknown music, although Barrios is better known here, but less so written about in the context of identity. So I found that really interesting to discover that, and to then also use, for example, Rolando Chaparro's album Bohemio, which was based on Barrios' songs, to understand how more modern versions of this music reflect a more contemporary take on this Paraguayanness.
All right, thank you. Thank you.
Alfredo, you have been moving across different interests in terms of music. So cover music or church music more generally, piano, you're a pianist, a very accomplished one. But then you did a PhD in ethnomusicology, which is interesting, at an American university. So I would be interested why ethnomusicology, and also what that then helped you to do later on with your specialism in Florentine Jimenez. I mean, it's fair to say you are the global specialist on Florentine Jimenez's music, which is absolutely cannot be overstated how important that is. So Alfredo, tell us a bit about your journey and why ethnomusicology at first, but I believe it has become possibly that is a discipline less significant now.
Yeah, thank you. Let me see if I can be brief about it. Yes, so I actually entered my doctoral studies in musicology, but I had an interest in the music of Paraguay. And at first I wanted to look at the possibility of doing some analysis of piano works by Paraguayan composers at that time. But right after my first semester, I had a meeting with my mentor, with Gerard Beag, and we were looking at possibilities for topics for research, also courses that I was supposed to take as well. And we discovered that if I switched to ethnomusicology at the University of Texas at Austin, at least at that time, it would give me more freedom to do what I wanted to do, say in piano music or in another topic. So that was one reason why I went into ethnomusicology. At the same time that I was considering piano music by Paraguayan composers, again, I went back to the harp, and I noticed that there've been other studies, other organological studies on musical instruments in Latin America, and that there was something unique about the Paraguayan harp in the sound. At that point, I was not necessarily speculating about cultural identity or other kinds of ideas. And so I had a meeting again with my mentor, and we discovered that the literature was minimal about not just the harp, but about Paraguayan music in general, even though we have some representative books that we still use and invoke. All of us that do research, that we go to Juan Máximo Edner, Música y Músicos del Paraguay. We go to Mauricio Cardoso Campo, his 3 volumes on Mundo Folclórico Paraguayo. We go to Dionisio González Torres, Folklore del Paraguay, and other ones that are representative. And so I thought, let me see what I can do and how I can incorporate the harp into a more active conversation with other topics in Latin American music. And that's what was very exciting to me, because of my previous training in musicology, or actually music history and literature. I had to take courses in anthropology and folklore during those years. And those were absolutely amazing courses with amazing instructors. And in reality, those seminars influence very highly for my research then, but also for my research now. So when I was, in a way, done with the Paraguayan harp, done meaning I was able to publish a monograph, although I'm not done with the continuing research on the instrument, I decided to focus on a Paraguayan composer, and I developed a friendship with Florentin Jimenez about 11, right now 12 years ago, probably. And I discovered that most of his music was unpublished, and that he had recorded most of his folk songs, but not necessarily professionally his classical music. And so I decided to slowly dig into his archives, also through interviews, just to know what was there. And then I found that there was a good opportunity to study the music of a Paraguayan composer that was alive at the time, but also to interact with ideas, again, coming from my approach of oral history, journalism, anthropology, classical music, music theory, all those elements. And the experience had been quite rewarding. And so that's been my journey so far. Thank you for the question, Simone.
Alfredo, listening to your story, especially moving from historical musicology to ethnomusicology, makes me think of my own academic background and how very dissimilar the 2 programs were at the time that we were there. I know you actually looked at both institutions, but I did my second master's, my master's in musicology, and then my PhD in musicology at the Florida State University. And it's interesting to me that we both came out of institutions with fairly different approaches, but with the same sort of instincts to think both historically and theoretically, music theory on the one hand, and on the other hand, the more ethnomusicological and anthropological framework, and sort of mixing those as needed. Because in the case of the musicology program at the Florida State University, there's actually only 1 degree. You don't get a PhD in ethnomusicology or a PhD in musicology. It's just a degree in musicology, and the emphasis is very much on musicology with a capital M, as they say. And while the two tracks require different sequences of coursework, when we got to doctoral seminars, when I was there, and I understand it's a little different now, but you just took, while I think we were required to have 4 semesters of doctoral seminar, you just took the professor who was teaching it the next semester. So it might be somebody who was primarily thought of as an ethnomusicologist, someone like Dale Olson, for example, really renowned Latin Americanist ethnomusicologist, or it might be somebody like Douglas Seaton, on the other hand, who's a renowned Mendelssohn scholar and scholar of 19th century European music and the art song. But those instructors had to structure the topics of the seminars broadly enough that both ethnomusicology students and historical musicology students could bring their particular sets of skills and interests and methodologies to bear on the overall topic of the seminar. And I know it was quite challenging for them. So you would wind up with topics like music and power, for example, with power interpreted quite broadly. But the idea really was that musicology is musicology. It is the study of music. And we may think of ourselves primarily as ethnomusicologists, although Simone, of course, doesn't want to do that. Or we may think of ourselves as historical musicologists, or we may even think of ourselves as music theorists, perhaps. Or cultural musicologists, but what we're all doing is studying music, and it's fascinating to me that we wound up with very much the same approach, despite very different academic backgrounds.
Absolutely, that's right. So in the end, we do share this idea of the multiple approaches to music, but from a holistic type of, I'll say, umbrella, where we are, really considering all the parts in order to understand, just like very good anthropologists, right, or cultural musicologists, to understand all the components of that which we're studying. Yes.
All right, so perhaps it's time to draw this conversatorio to a close. This has been a fascinating panel, and we have all already said several times, but it is worth saying again how deeply appreciative we all are of Cheporeka, of the Cheporeka project, and also, of course, of Berta Rojas, who really gave birth to this idea of Cheporeka, and not just as a series of performances, but also with a critical, scholarly, and academic component as well. And we appreciate their support and their interest of the work that we do. Thank you once again to Dr. Simone Krueger-Bridge and to Dr. Alfredo Colman, and we look forward to working together again. And we thank those of you who are viewing this and who will view it in the future. We're always willing to answer questions and look forward to interacting with other scholars and musicians and lovers of Paraguayan music. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias.